The iconic Negro Aroused, originally sculpted by Edna in 1935, is symbolic of her contribution to the arts in Jamaica. The work, intended to signify the struggle of the black man to break free from slavery into freedom, and metaphorically Jamaica's struggle for independence, also signifies the struggle and triumph of arts and culture in Jamaica. It is a representation of a vision of a people being awakened to a new consciousness. And in this new consciousness is where the artist can be, create, and inspire. The Honorable Edna Manley used Negro Aroused as a symbol of the Jamaica School of Art. Its inception in 1940, and it remains a symbol of the School of Visual Arts here at the college, which bears her name. We're therefore quite honored here at the Edna Manley College of the Visual and Performing Arts to join with the Edna Manley Foundation to present the 2015 Edna Manley Memorial Lecture in order to preserve, document, and display the works of Edna Manley and to continue to perpetuate her memory. The late Professor Nettleford, in tribute to Edna Manley, writes, "She was a great and courageous artist who took risks, investing in the talents of the young from all walks of life. Edna Manley led the way in giving to our people an artistic voice, a mirror image of self." We welcome you and we celebrate this occasion. Thank you.
Dr. Brian Meeks is the director of the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies and professor of social and political change at the University of the West Indies, Mona campus, Cave Hill, and St. Augustine campuses. He's also taught at Michigan State University, Florida International University, and Anton de Kom University of Suriname, and served as a visiting scholar at Cambridge University, Stanford University, and Brown University. His academic career has centered on questions of citizenship and governance, Caribbean sovereignty, and political ideologies. Professor Meeks is the author of many articles and over 10 books and edited collections, including the 1993 Caribbean Revolutions and Revolutionary Theory. A new edition was actually published in 2001. Other edited publications included the popular 2001 New Caribbean Thought, A Reader, and Envisioning Caribbean Futures of Jamaican Perspectives in 2007. A couple of his publications in the last few years have engaged the works of Caribbean intellectuals such as M.G. Smith and Gordon K. Lewis. Professor Meeks' most recent single-authored book, Critical Interventions in Caribbean Politics and Theory, was published last year in 2014. It's a series of essays reflecting on post-colonial Caribbean radical politics and ideologies. Meeks is also an artist himself of sort, a literary artist. His novel, Paint the Town Red, was published in 2003. On behalf of the Edna Manley Foundation and the Edna Manley College, we would warmly welcome Professor Meeks. His talk today is entitled The Politics of Edna Manley, a Preliminary Appraisal.
Dr. Nicolene DeGrasse Johnson, Sir Kenneth and Lady Hall, Most Honorable Mrs. Michael Manley, members of the Diplomatic Corps, members of the Edna Manley Foundation, staff, faculty of the Edna Manley School. I'm going to do one thing before I start and make sure that my clicker is working. I think it is. When Joseph Manley, where is he, first asked me to give this lecture, without further thought, but with great humility, I said yes. As for many reasons, none stated here, it would have been quite impossible for me to say otherwise. But then I immediately began to reflect on the mountain that I would have to climb, and the task became increasingly daunting, indeed frightening, because others have ascended this hill before and with extraordinary success. Thus, Wayne Brown's biographic reflections on Edna's private early years in England, mentioned earlier, and in Jamaica before the 1938 uprising, David Boxer's wonderfully produced Edna Manley, Sculptor, Rachel Manley's memoirs, Horses in Her Hair, and her carefully edited collection of Edna's diaries are all in their own way sensitive, thorough, and in many respects complete assessments of the life of this remarkable Jamaican woman. Yet, when I began rereading them all, as the inevitable prelude to my own reflections, it struck me that there was a clear and evident lacuna. Though it is impossible to consider Edna Manley without taking into account her evident role and insertion into the mainstream of modern Jamaican politics, and though politics runs through the interstices of all of these important assessments, there is to date no attempt to understand the politics of Edna Manley in its own right. This absence is particularly noteworthy if we recall that she was cousin and husband to one Jamaican national hero, often considered the father of the national movement, cousin to a second who actually led the country into independence, and mother to two sons, both of whom became members of parliament, and one, Michael, became the fourth and arguably most outstanding, if not always most lauded, Prime Minister of post-colonial Jamaica. And of course, by politics here, I'm not referring to her partisan inclinations, which remained, as far as I know, from the birth of the People's National Party in 1938 until her passing in February 1987, firmly supportive of that organization. Nor am I using it in the sense of the Greek etymology, concerned mainly with the business of the polis or the state. Rather, I'm using politics in two ways that carry us beyond this. The first is in the Aristotelian sense, which is concerned with a political community whose ultimate aims must be a conversation around how the good life is realized and how might it be possible and feasible to bring it into being, and how to bring into being a just society. The second approach, more Foucauldian in character, approaches politics as being at the heart of all collective social activity, including, therefore, that all social interaction, whether language, sexuality, culture, etc., is inevitably political, or a second wave feminists would argue with great effect, even the personal is political. From such a perspective, then, the questions to be asked would encompass a far more extensive spectrum and relate not only to Manley's overt political predilections, but to an appraisal of her times, her character, her social formation, the critical junctures and conjunctures that shifted her focus, and how all of these were reflected and refracted through her main media of artistic expression, sculpture and drawing, and in her less heralded but significantly important writing in her diary entries. To attempt to address these, I want to take us through three stages. First, I attempt to tease out the foundations of her intellectual formation. Then, I suggest two significant tensions in her life that followed her into adulthood and became a sort of muse and energy for her entire career. Then, I want to propose 5 main themes in her politics that derive from the earlier amalgam. And finally, viewing a selection of her most outstanding pieces, I want to think about how Edna Manley's politics was made manifest in her art. I begin with the foundations. And I hear this March 1st date, but that's not the date I know, so forgive me. Edna Swithenbank, born in Bournemouth, England on February 28, 1900, was the 5th child and 3rd daughter of Harvey Swithenbank, a Wesleyan minister, and his Jamaican wife, Ellie Shearer. Swithenbank had married Ellie during a period of residence in Jamaica and then returned to England, where, alongside peripatetic work for his church, he sought to raise a large family, eventually numbering 9 children. However, he suffered from repeated bouts of ill health and died tragically when Edna was only 9, leaving Ellie the unenviable task of raising 9 children by herself. This brief and well-known summary of her origins reveals as much as it obscures. The turn of the century was a world very different from that which would emerge 2 decades later. It was the domain of European imperial powers that had conquered the globe, with few notable exceptions. Thus, the Berlin Conference of 1884-85 had divided Africa among the major European powers, ensuring that alongside the usual suspects, the newly emergent German nation, with its powerful economic and military bases, had its fair share of the continent's immeasurable wealth. The West Indies, of course, had, following emancipation in 1838, the Sugar Duties Act of 1846, and the institution of Crown Colony government in Jamaica after the 1865 Morant Bay Rebellion, slipped into the stasis and torpor of a colonial backwater. Loyalty to empire remained largely intact, certainly as an official transcript, and Britannia and her ideology ruled the waves. Central to that ideology was the question of race, and as Stuart Hall has suggested, racism in its sordid history has undergone many transformations. However, by the turn of the century, that is the 19th century, with the consolidation of European empire, a new virulent version based on scientific assertions of white superiority was consolidating. It would soon find a pseudoscientific home in the eugenics movement, with its heinous notions of racial purification through breeding and separation of the races. But this is the point at which, yes, there we go. It is in this historical context that we need to read Harvey's marriage to Ellie, who is variously described by her great-granddaughter Rachel as mulatto, or by her nephew and later son-in-law Norman, reflecting on his mother Margaret, but equally on her sister and his aunt Ellie as an, quote, almost pure white woman, unquote. While it is difficult to discern in faded black and white prints what exactly Ellie looked like, my own conclusion is that in Jamaica she would have been a fair-skinned brown lady, not to be mistaken in polite company for white, but that in the less keen and discerning atmosphere of the Cornish coast, she would have passed quite easily if no mention were ever made of her colored ancestors. I raise the question of race, an often uncomfortable matter in polite Jamaican discourse, precisely because it is silenced and muffled today almost as much as it was more than a century ago. What were the hurdles, both psychological and social, that Harvey had to cross to marry Ellie? Or was her phenotype sufficiently white that the question was never raised? Certainly, one factor that has to be considered is that the young preacher was not just Methodist, but Wesleyan, among the more socially conscious of the mainstream churches then, as it remains today. Thus, in an online post, the Wesleyans argue that their church, quote, emphasizes applying the Christian experience to social issues. Discrimination and prejudice are key topics of concern, whether applied to race, gender, age, or other areas of life. The foundation is Galatians 3:28. And there's an internal quote. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither bond nor free. There is neither male nor female. For ye are all one in Christ Jesus, unquote. Yet, whether or not Harvey was enlightened or alternatively ignorant of Ellie's background, she was fully aware. And since the question was unlikely to be asked in Cornwall, where they settled, then silence on this matter was for her the default condition. I harp on this because if Wayne Brown's assessment is to be given weight, then it is Edna's public acknowledgement of her colored ancestry which leads to seismic waves within her family and suggests the importance of those silences in her own formation as an English girl growing up in Cornwall, but with these anomalous, shady connections to the colony of Jamaica. But we are running ahead of our story. By the way, the one in the front of the picture, sitting in the middle, that is our subject. But we're running ahead of our story as we try to trace some of the critical elements in her formation. The silences and hidden tensions of her Jamaican background were accompanied by other critical features of her personality and education to help determine her peculiar formation. Edna was a middle child, and with the caveat of the dangers of my indulging in cheap psychology, she demanded attention. This impulse assuaged somewhat whilst her father was alive by his indulgence of arguably his favorite, increased immeasurably following his untimely death. Described by Rachel as a, quote, defiant, willful teenager, unquote. She was a rebel at nearby Cornwall College, though she gained the respect of the headmistress, a Miss Hannah, who wrote her a remarkable character report, and I quote from it. She's original, and therefore she sometimes does the unexpected or unsuspected. Conventions are light and airy things to her, capable of destruction at a moment's notice. For anyone who desires not to be dull, to have many subjects on which to ponder, I recommend this youngster as a companion. I understand that she hankers after teaching. May the Lord have mercy on her and them. Unquote. It was this definitive feature of her character, a certain independent tomboyishness, an unwillingness to unthinkingly accept authority that guides her decisions and choices in these early phases, and indeed for the rest of her life. It was certainly recognized by her cousin Norman Manley, who, arriving from Jamaica and visiting Ellis' home shortly before taking up the roads at Oxford, is asked by his aunt, "Which one do you like the best?" and answers without hesitation, quote, "I think the plain one with the spirit," unquote. Another crucial element for which Hannah was responsible was introducing the impressionable young woman to the work of William Blake, 1757 to 1827. The English painter, poet, and printmaker, largely unheralded in his lifetime, had come by the end of the century to be a leading figure in the Romantic tradition. Blake, like Wordsworth, supported the French Revolution and adopted an attitude of ardent opposition to the abuses of class power in England. However, in his manifest spirituality, he was not by any stretch a typical Enlightenment thinker. While retaining an opposition to the established Church of England, still shocking in its day, he was never opposed to religion in itself. He advocated instead a more liberal interpretation of Christianity, which railed against the sexual conservatism of the church, as he promoted a doctrine of free love far beyond the conventions of early 19th century Britain. William Blake, often seen as a progenitor of modern anarchism, would, I suggest, become the single most profound influence on young Swithenbank's intellectual and aesthetic growth. One need only look at the subject matter and form of some of Blake's work, such as The Body of Abel, found by Adam and Eve, 1825, or the synthesis in his poetry of spiritual redemption with political radicalism, to see the patent connections and echoes in her emerging oeuvre. Two other influences appear to be significant to our purposes. Her eldest sister, Lena, was a first-wave feminist and campaigned with the suffragettes to give women the vote. While Edna would never herself focus on gender liberation and repeatedly in her diaries expresses reservations over aspects of the strategy and tactics of the second wave 1970s feminists, it is difficult to argue against the fact that in her unconventional, for Jamaica, resistance to female domesticity and her own artistic independence and leadership of the Jamaican arts movement, she was a gender revolutionary in praxis, if not in theory. The second is Fabian socialism. The Fabian Society, formed in London in 1884 and named after the Roman general Fabius Maximus, who famously adopted successful gradualist tactics to wear down the power of Hannibal's army, was highly influential in early 20th century England. Supported by influential people such as George Bernard Shaw and H.G. Wells, and with the competent leadership of Sidney and Beatrice Webb, the Fabians were central in the formation of the Labour Party in the same year of Edna's birth and in forging its subsequent political form. While advocating for social justice beyond the typical liberal reforms and a social welfare system modeled along the German Bismarckian model, the Fabians stopped short of supporting radical revolution. Indeed, early Fabian positions considered the empire as the right and appropriate framework for development, and as such they could be considered staunch imperialists, though it should be recalled that the permanency of empire was very much a part of the zeitgeist of those times. One can, in scouring Edna's reflections, find cohabiting with each other the Fabian binary of both a deep concern for social justice and social reform, and a constant refrain of caution of the dangers present in precipitate radical approaches. What we can then summarize of Edna's early philosophical formation is that it was a heady brew of a rebellious and forthright personality with an unusual, unresolved connection to the colonies, which had been influenced by Blakean anarcho-spiritual sentiments, early feminism, and Fabian notions of gradualist social change. This amalgam would come to a boil and take on new forms in the next phase when Edna met and fell in love with her cousin Norman Manley and decided after marriage to follow him to the land of his birth and the place of her imagination, Jamaica. I now want to look at the two tensions that I previously referred to, which I consider developed beyond her early formation. The cut and thrust of her unconventional love affair with her cousin is the stuff of Jamaican lore and shall not detain us except in its most important outlines. Edna, as mentioned earlier, met her cousin 6 years her senior when he was on his way to Oxford to take up the roads, and she was only 14. It would take 4 more years, the crucial intervention of the First World War, Norman's enrollment and fighting in France, the death of both Edna's brother Leslie and Norman's brother Roy in the war, and numerous letters exchanged for them to know that they were in love. My suggestion at this stage is that the critical hurdle that Edna had to face in entering this new phase was not so much the unconventional relationship between two cousins, but the color question. And caught up in this was the implications as to how she might define herself. Unlike Edna, whose phenotype was for all intents and purposes white, Norman's rich mahogany complexion clearly revealed his West African genes. In his sliver of a memoir, he makes the point that he was defined by his color in Britain. Quote, "As far back as 1914, it was impossible to be in England and not be aware of the problem of color. You were immediately aware in 1,000 ways that you belonged elsewhere, but not there. You were different." Indeed, Vera Manley, Norman's sister, and with whom Edna was corresponding, and whose, of course, hall we're in, my apologies, and with whom Edna was corresponding as to how to approach and tell her mother, captured it appropriately in her response to Edna, and I quote from Vera, "You seem to expect a row. So did I at first. I've changed my opinion. I don't see how there can be a row very well. Auntie Ellie disapproves of cousins marrying, or says she does. Frankly, I think it is entirely because of the color question. And without offending all 3 of us forever, it's a thing she can't bring up. And the offense here is against Vera, Norman, and Muriel, which are her other sister, Norman's sister, who she's referring to." Unquote. Yet Ellie would try one last time on the eve of the wedding to dissuade them. That is, Ellie, Edna's mother, would try to dissuade them. Wayne Brown writes, and I quote, "With a fortnight to go, Ellie Swithenbank, who had vacillated between a reluctant acceptance and fits of anxiety, raised once more the question of the undesirability of children in a mixed marriage. Norman, in barely restrained anger, wrote to Edna asking her permission, and I quote in the quotes from Norman, to point out to Edna's family 1 or 2 moral trifles that they don't seem to grasp." That's Norman. To which Edna responded to Norman, and this is Edna, "Leave her alone and she'll get accustomed to anything. Argue against her and you'll drive her to the wildest extremes. You'll upset the wedding and I'll lose my little remnant of a home forever."